Welcome back to Respondent Behavior. This is video part 7. We're beginning with objective 23, define and describe potentiation. Objective 24 is define and describe sensitization. Objective 25 is to discriminate between examples and non-examples of respondent processes. 26 is to define and describe respondent extinction. And 27 is to define and describe spontaneous recovery. Objective 23, define and describe potentiation. Now, potentiation is an increase in a dimension of a reflex response due to repeated stimulus presentation. So just like habituation, potentiation is a respondent process. Also like habituation, potentiation results from the repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Only one stimulus, but it's presented multiple times. Potentiation is different from habituation in that it is a gradual increase in a dimension of a reflex response or a strengthening of that reflex response. Whereas habituation is a gradual decrease in a dimension of a reflex response or a weakening. So a single stimulus is repeatedly presented. There are multiple stimulus presentations or multiple stimulations. Potentiation has a dimension-altering effect on the reflex response. In this case, it's a strengthening of the reflex response. And it's a strengthening of the reflex response there. And its permanence is that potentiation is temporary. Okay. I'll also note that, remember that the dimension-altering effect of habituation was that it weakened the reflex response. Here, potentiation strengthens the reflex response, and that's its dimension-altering effect. Its potentiation is typically observed for aversive stimuli, such as in the experimental paradigm called fear-potentiated startle. Now here's an example. So the child hears thunder outside but does not startle. Then thunder happens again, and then each subsequent instance of thunder elicits a startle response. The next night, thunder occurs but the child does not startle. Well, that's because the potentiation is temporary. Now here's some non-examples of potentiation. I give you one grape and you ask for more. Or the student answers some questions posed in class by the teacher. When they were called on, then they start shouting out answers loudly without being called on. Now that's not potentiation. The beagle whimpered when you said speak several times, but after saying speak the 5th time, the beagle howled loudly. No, because these aren't reflex responses here. Now the dentist asked the child to say ah so that he could inspect their teeth. The child didn't quite open wide enough, and the dentist said again, say ah, and the child opened their mouth wider. No, that's not respondent behavior. We're not talking reflexes responses here, so these aren't examples of potentiation. You play peekaboo with the infant, and the infant coos the first few times, then they show a big smile. That's not potentiation. It's not a reflex response. ASR 24. Potentiation is A, a reflex with multiple stimuli, B, a classical conditioning procedure, C, a process triggered by repeated presentation of one stimulus, or D, all of the above. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer is C, a process triggered by repeated presentation of one stimulus. And potentiation is characterized by A, an increase in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus, or B, a decrease in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus, C, first-order conditioning response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus, D, a decrease in the eye blink response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is A, an increase in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Why is B out? B is out because it's not characterized by a decrease. Actually, B here describes habituation. And there's no such thing as a first order conditioning response, so C is out. And potentiations, it's characterized by an increase, not a decrease. This says decrease, so D's out right at that point. But also, potentiation is not particular to any specific reflex, so the eye blink response is not something which characterizes potentiation. So, Okay, objective 24 is to define and describe sensitization. That's our last respondent process. Sensitization is an increase in a dimension of a reflex response to one stimulus due to the elicitation of the reflex response by a different stimulus. So sensitization is similar to potentiation in that there's an increase in a dimension of the reflex response. So that's different than the decrease you would see with habituation. But habituation and potentiation result from the repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Notice that sensitization is the result of the presentation of two stimuli. First, one stimulus that elicits a reflex response. Then a second stimulus that elicits the reflex response specifically because the reflex response was already elicited by the first stimulus. If that second stimulus were presented alone and not after the elicitation of the reflex response by the first stimulus, then the second stimulus wouldn't have its eliciting effect. Okay? So the eliciting effects of one stimulus are enhanced as a result of presentations of some other stimulus. One stimulus amplifies the eliciting effect of another stimulus. Those are quotes from Catania 2013. Two stimuli are presented in sequence. The second stimulus elicits a reflex response only after the first stimulus elicits the reflex response. And it is a strengthening of the tendency for the second stimulus to elicit the reflex response. Sensitization has a dimension-altering effect on the reflex response. It strengthens it. And the permanence is that sensitization also is temporary. I'll give you an example here. This is Betsy, also known as Betsy Boo Boos, who was my dog many years ago. And I'll tell you a story about Betsy the dog, her name, fireworks, and the startle response. So poor Betsy had some type of condition. I don't know what it is, but I didn't know anything about Betsy's learning history because she was a rescue from the shelter. But what we found out shortly after we adopted her, that she was really sensitive to some aspects of the environment and was easily startled by certain sounds or other changes in the environment. And we had the brilliant, and I'm being sarcastic, idea to bring her with us, my wife and I, to fireworks one year. It was a bad idea. Okay, and so I'll tell you this story here and why it was such a bad idea to bring her to the fireworks. So if we said her name Betsy and called her, she wouldn't startle. That didn't bother her. Okay, but on this day where we went to the fireworks, once the fireworks once the fireworks started, they startled her. Okay, so the fireworks elicited the startle response. And then when we called her name, Betsy, she startled again. Okay, and so prior to the fireworks beginning, if we said her name, she didn't startle. But once the fireworks happened and the fireworks startled her, then saying her name had this effect of eliciting the startle response. So the first stimulus was the fireworks, and then the second stimulus was saying her name. So the process there is sensitization. The fireworks enhance the tendency or strengthen the tendency of her name as an eliciting stimulus with respect to the startle response. Okay, non-examples of sensitization. I offered you water and you declined, then you ate some salty crackers, and then I offered you water again and you accepted it. That's not an example of sensitization, even though there's two stimuli and there's this increased tendency for the response to occur. This example describes operant behavior, not respondent behavior. The student wasn't answering questions in class, but then other students started answering questions correctly, and the next time you called on this student, they answered your question. Well, there's no reflex response there, so not sensitization. The beagle didn't howl when you said speak, but when you showed it a bacon snack and said speak, it howled. Or when you play peekaboo with the infant, but they don't smile, then you tickle them, and then they start to smile when you play peekaboo. No, that's not sensitization. There's no reflex responses in these scenarios. That is, there are no responses that are exclusively controlled by antecedent stimuli or elicitors. Okay, ASR 26. Sensitization is A, a procedure involving a stimulus presented at least twice. B, a process triggered by the presentation of at least two different respondent stimuli. C, a Pavlovian conditioning procedure. Or D, all of the above. Give you a couple seconds. Okay, I'll close the poll, and the answer is B. It's a process triggered by the presentation of at least two different respondent stimuli. Okay, this is A says a procedure involving a stimulus presented at least twice. Nah, it's two stimuli. Okay, you need two stimuli for it to be sensitization. Sensitization is not a conditioning procedure, it's a process. Pavlovian conditioning procedures were short delay, long delay, trace, simultaneous, and backward. ASR 27. Sensitization is characterized by A, an increase in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. B, an increase in the response to one stimulus following a response to another stimulus. C, a decrease in the response to one stimulus following a response to another stimulus. Or D, a decrease in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Give you a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is B, an increase in the response to one stimulus following a response to another stimulus. And you might have selected C. If you did, you may not have noticed that the word here, decrease, and it's saying there's a decrease. And sensitization is not characterized by a decrease in responsiveness, it's an increase in responsiveness. The other two options involve presentation of a single stimulus. Okay, so here's a table that summarizes the critical information that I presented to you about these three basic respondent processes. So this table will probably be helpful for studying, so I just provide this table for you, but we're not going to discuss it here. Okay, now it's ASR time. 25 is to discriminate between examples and non-examples of respondent processes. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story here and about Carla, the birthday party, and the clown. And actually, what I'm going to do here is we're going to end this video part now, and then I'll see you in the next video part, and we'll begin this story and go through some ASRs.